This is China.
Shanghai! Shanghai! Shanghai!
Protests are breaking out all over the country against the CCP and their authoritarian rule. As the number of protesters grow, the CCP is worried more and more about things getting out of control. Just a few days ago, protests in Shengshao turned violent between authorities and protesters. As of Saturday night, there are protests happening in 13 Chinese cities and around 80 Chinese universities. By the time I finish editing this video, these numbers are likely to be much bigger. According to several experts, this is the most serious moment in China's history since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989. Because of the threat these protests represent for the CCP, government censors have been quick to block any and all news of these protests from social media. There are signal jammers following the protesters, so they can't post on the internet and communicate with other people. Websites and apps like Weibo and WeChat went dark to stop people from sharing the news about the protests. If there's an off chance that CCP bots may try downvoting this video, I want you guys to take a quick second and hit that like button below. It would help me out a lot. This is the first time ever under President Xi Jinping that Chinese citizens are openly opposing the central government and their rule. This is the first time in a long time people have voiced their opinions against the government, despite what it means for their personal safety. You might be wondering what changed all of a sudden that citizens are so furious with the CCP. The reason behind these protests was a fire in an apartment building in Urumqi, where an estimated 10 people died, and it was all because of the CCP's mismanagement. So before talking more about what these protests mean for the CCP's rule, let's back up a little bit and talk about how a fire in a faraway region gave rise to a movement that threatens the CCP's existence.
His overall policy of zero COVID policy.
There are constant lockdowns and mandatory PCR tests around every corner.
Fences to stop people leaving their flats.
Using bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
Electronic magnetic alarms are going to be placed on the front doors of some people in places where they have tested.
Problems started brewing back in March, when China experienced a spike in daily record COVID cases. The CCP made COVID public enemy number one and decided to get China into its utopia-like goal of zero COVID. To achieve this goal, the CCP implemented zero COVID restrictions to stop the spread. If there was even just a single positive COVID case, the CCP would lock down millions of people, shut down thousands of businesses, and implement excessive mass testing. Doing all this basically crippled people's daily lives. But that didn't matter to President Xi Jinping. The government was dealing with COVID as if it was still 2019. All while the rest of the world has moved on. When I say lockdown, I don't mean like a normal lockdown. No. Just like anything the CCP does, this was forceful. Apartment buildings were locked from the outside so people couldn't leave. Neighborhoods were barricaded. And if there was any suspicion of someone having COVID, they were forcefully removed from their family and quarantined in a very much jail cell-looking facility. Even infants and toddlers were not an exception to this rule. Yes, you heard that right. The CCP would actually separate kids from their parents and put them in a quarantine facility. Turns out all of these very forceful policies are now what is coming back to bite the CCP. But we'll get into that in just a second.
In one of the world's richest cities, residents scream, "Give us food." Last week, they were so hungry they ransacked a grocery store.
The world's third largest city remains in lockdown. 25 million residents ordered confined to their homes.
They're using bicycle locks and padlocks just to keep people in.
You're shut in. There's like a paper barrier keeping you from exiting, going to the food market.
I can't go outside that door. There's a seal.
In this apartment complex, a woman screams, "We are starving to death."
It's straight out of a dystopian sci-fi movie. Some people are yelling out, "We're starving."
Initially, it was an inconvenience for citizens. since they've learned to let the government overreach slide, just as long as the CCP achieves their goals that improve Chinese citizens' lives. Now remember, that's the most important part. As long as the CCP achieves its goal. The goal of these lockdowns was to kill COVID, achieve a zero COVID target set by President Xi Jinping. But as the days passed, then the weeks passed, then months passed, it didn't seem like the CCP was getting any closer to achieving their goal. In fact, the COVID cases just kept spiking. You can feel that Chinese citizens were getting tired of giving up their lives for something that doesn't seem to be working. Slowly, a movement started brewing. Social media posts started circulating about how lockdowns just don't work and people want their lives back. Worse yet, posts about people dying because of these lockdown measures started picking up steam like wildfire. On November 3rd, a 3-year-old boy died in his father's hands after a gas leak because a COVID worker wouldn't let them leave the apartment complex to seek treatment for the child. The delay proved fatal for the kid whose whole life consisted of lockdown and pandemic. This caused a massive uproar on Chinese social media, before posts were quickly taken down to contain the crisis. Then there was another huge protest at Apple's Foxconn facility. And you guessed it, it was because of lockdown measures. Foxconn had its workers working in this closed-loop management system, where workers would work, live, and sleep in the factories. They were allowed no outside contact at all. As workers slowly got sick of all this, protests broke out and the news reached the international media. Things got so out of hand that there were violent clashes between the workers and the police. Unfortunately, I can't show all the clips because of the YouTube community guidelines, but here are just some of the clips to give you an idea. If you want more news and clips like this, be sure to follow me on Twitter, as I share things there a lot quicker and more openly.
China, news of the protests is censored, but internationally the optics aren't good. Critics say Apple has put itself in a difficult situation with an extreme dependence on China as a manufacturer and as a consumer market.
You can probably tell by now protests are picking up. But until now, they were still under control. Until the fire in Urumqi. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This is what gave rise to the protests across the nation. This is what led to people chanting in the streets against the CCP and Xi Jinping. This is why current events are considered the most serious moment in China's history since Tiananmen Square.
Media footage from China appears to show people in the western city of Urumqi protesting against COVID restrictions. This is after a fire in a block of flats killed 10 people.
According to state media, the cause of the fire was a short circuit in the electrical panel.
Came after an apartment block fire killed 10 people.
Urumqi officials denied that COVID measures had hampered escape and rescue, but said they would investigate further.
On November 24th, 8:35 p.m., a building under this zero COVID lockdown caught on fire. Residents of the building had been locked in for more than 3 months, and when the fire started, they couldn't get out because the doors were most likely locked from the outside. On top of that, the fire department was unable to get into the compound of the building for 3 hours after the fire started because the compound was barricaded so people couldn't leave. In this clip, you can see the fire department trying to put out the fire, but water couldn't reach the building because they were so far away. It's just sad. The fire resulted in 10 people dead, including 3 children, and left 9 more hospitalized. As the news of the fire spread through the nation, protests broke out across the country. Officials tried blaming the fire victims for their deaths. They claimed that the victims were not strong enough to save themselves, while the people blamed the CCP and its strict COVID policy for the deaths. It's also important to note that the protests first started in Urumqi, which is in Xinjiang. Crowds took to the streets on Friday night in Urumqi, chanting "End the lockdown" and pumping their fists in the air. Video showed people in a plaza singing China's national anthem with its lyric, "Rise up, those who refuse to be slaves," while others shouted that they wanted to be released from lockdowns. This kind of uprising is rare in these regions. where authorities in 2017 launched a security clampdown that forced more than 1 million of the region's Uyghur, Kazakh, and other mostly Muslim peoples into re-education programs. Shanghai was another region where massive protests took place. Late on Saturday night, hundreds of residents gathered for a candlelight vigil on Urumqi Road to mourn the victims of the fire. This was captured on videos widely circulated and promptly censored on Chinese social media. By the way, another reminder to please give this video a like, just in case any bots are trying to suppress the news. People also chanted, "We need human rights, we need freedom," while also calling for Xi Jinping and the Communist Party to step down. The crowd also chanted, "We don't want COVID tests, we want freedom. And we don't want a dictatorship, we want democracy." Then, in the early morning, rows of police officers, who were initially just observing, started to move in and push the crowd back, dividing them. This sparked a tense face-off between the police and the protesters. According to a CNN report, several people were arrested and taken into police custody shortly after. Several were also taken behind police lines. Numerous videos showed hundreds of people at an intersection shouting, "Release the people," in a demand for the police to free the detained demonstrators. Even in Beijing, protests are picking up too. People are shouting, "No nucleic acid testing, we want food to eat. No lockdowns, we want freedom. No lies, we want dignity. No cultural revolution, we want reform. No dictatorial leaders, we want elections. No slaves, we want to be citizens." Even as I'm writing this script, there's news of the Chinese police targeting journalists if they are caught recording videos on their phones. The CCP is also kicking out foreign reporters to limit the information that gets out of China about this situation. Many of these protests have broken out on university campuses, which are particularly politically sensitive to the Communist Party, given the history of the student-led Tiananmen Square protests in 1989. As of writing this script, there are over 70 universities where protests have taken place against COVID controls. In my opinion, the most notable one being Tsinghua University, which is a top-tier university in China, and also Xi Jinping's alma mater. There, the students chanted, "We need democracy, we need rule of law, we want freedom of expression." It seems like protests are picking up by the second. This is a very important story in China's history, and it's moving pretty fast. This is probably one of the fastest videos we have ever put together, but please, follow me on Twitter for the most up-to-date news as things are moving so quickly. Videos are going to be slower than tweets.